of firsts on this first Sunday of February, which is Black History Month. Thomas Jennings was the first African American to hold a patent in this country in 1821.
Macon Allen was the first African American licensed to practice law in 1845.
Thomas Peterson was the first African American to vote in an election in 1870.
In the same year, Richard Greener, first African American to graduate from Harvard.
Booker T. Washington was the first African American invited to dine at the White House in 1901.
Jack Johnson, first African American heavyweight boxing champion, 1908.
Madam C.J. Walker, first African American woman millionaire, 1910.
Alfred Masters, first African American member of the U.S. Marine Corps, 1942.
Jackie Robinson, the first African American Major League Baseball player, ending 60 years of segregated leagues in 1947.
Count Basie was the first African American artist to receive sole credit for a #1 hit on the Billboard music charts, 1947.
Wendell Scott, first African American driver in NASCAR, 1952.
Edward Brooke, first African American Attorney General of a state in 1961.
Sidney Poitier, first African American to win the Academy Award for Best Actor, 1964.
Patricia Harris, first African American woman ambassador of the United States, 1965.
Cal B. Stokes, first African American mayor of a large U.S. city, 1967. In the same year,
The Falcon was the first African American superhero in Marvel Comics.
Beverly Johnson, first African American model on the cover of Vogue magazine, 1974.
In the same year, Daniel James, the first African American 4-star general.
Guy Bluford Jr., the first African American astronaut in 1983.
Carol Gist, first African American Miss USA, 1990.
Toni Morrison, first African American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, 1993.
Franklin Raines, first African American CEO of a Fortune 500 company, 1999.
Colin Powell, first African American Secretary of State, 2001.
In the same year, Halle Berry, first African American woman to win the Academy Award for Best Actress.
Condoleezza Rice, first African American woman appointed Secretary of State, 2005.
Barbara Hillary, first African American woman to reach the North Pole, 2007.
Barack Obama, first African American Barack Obama, first African American elected President of the United States, 2008.
Michelle Obama, first African American First Lady of the United States.
In the same year, Eric Holder, first African American United States Attorney General.
Oh. Go for it, Eric Holder. Loretta Lynch, first African American woman to be Attorney General of the U.S., 2015.
Channing Dungey, first African American president of a major broadcast TV network, 2016. And in the same year,
Dr. Carla Hayden, the first African American Librarian of Congress.
Thus ends our litany of firsts. The first public protest I participated in was here in Tulsa, actually, after Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted by a jury. Today would have been Trayvon Martin's 22nd birthday. We marched from here down Peoria to 41st Street, then we turned around and marched back. Some people wore hoodies. Some carried photos of the unarmed 17-year-old boy who had been shot and killed by a neighborhood watch captain. Others carried signs that said, "I am Trayvon." I remember standing in a circle on the front lawn before the march with local organizers and representatives from various groups and with many members of All Souls, including some of you, while Reverend Davis led us in a rousing prayer. Then, as dusk was falling, we headed off down Peoria. I wasn't really sure why I was marching. I did it partly because it felt like my duty as a minister of the church, but it didn't really seem to me like a march down Peoria would make much of a difference in anyone's life. While we were marching, people honked their horns and waved at us in support. Black drivers especially, but white ones too. We could feel it when the cars with people who didn't care or approve drove by, and a few of those people shouted angrily at us. But it wasn't until months later, really, that I realized how marching had changed me, if not the world. It may not have made much of a difference in the outcome of the case, and only time will reveal its influence on race relations in the United States of America. But it mattered to the people I marched with and to the people who drove by. That was clear. And so it started to matter to me too. And it felt really good to be connected to people I didn't know and to realize that we are part of a larger movement. Now, doing something for the first time is always a risk. On our first day at a new school, or on a first date, or at our first job, or on our first day at a new church, we don't know if we're going to feel included and successful or excluded and like we failed. We don't know if we might never want to do that thing again, or if we will find the very thing that we want to do, or the place we want to be, or the person we want to be with for the rest of our lives. The only thing we do know is that if we don't try, we'll never discover what's possible. So somewhere after the first of this year, I went to the movies to see Hidden Figures. If you haven't gone yet, who has gone already? Okay. If you haven't gone yet, I strongly recommend you do, and I'm going to do my best not to ruin the movie for you this morning, I promise. The title, Hidden Figures, refers to 3 black women featured in the film: Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Dorothy Vaughan. All 3, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of women mathematicians, were hidden from the public eye and missing from our history books until now. They were hidden figures partly because they were women and partly because they were black, despite the fact that they were key contributors to our country's space program. It's very likely we all could have lived our lives without ever hearing their stories if it weren't for another ordinary and extraordinary black woman, the one who wrote the book that inspired the movie. Margot Lee Shetterly is her name, and she grew up just a few miles away from NASA Langley. So for her, as a girl and as a young woman, the brilliant female mathematicians were simply her neighbors and her Sunday school teachers, the neighborhood Girl Scout troop leader, and the parents of her friends. Her father worked at Langley too, starting as an engineering intern and becoming a well-respected climate scientist. But it wasn't until Shetterly noticed her husband, who wasn't from the area, listening to her father talk about the work these women had done, that Shetterly realized something was hidden here, something worth uncovering. The movie takes place in the 1960s, but what you don't see in the movie is that the first black computers, which means the black women who were extremely good at math, that the first black computers had started to work at Langley in the 1940s. The plan to put women to work emerged as America headed towards World War II, as the push for progress with planes and weaponry and what they could do in a war became more and more pressing. But it wasn't until civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph proposed a march on Washington, D.C., to draw attention to the continuing injustices of racial discrimination. It wasn't until the president faced the threat of 100,000 people coming to the Capitol, it wasn't until then that Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, preventing racial discrimination in hiring for federal and war-related work. By the 60s, the time period of the movie, the focus of the work had shifted from the war to the race into space. Our president then, President Kennedy, was determined to put a man on the moon before the Russians did. Still, 100 years after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, after black men had fought valiantly in 2 world wars, the African American women were still segregated on the western end of the campus and called the West computers. They struggled daily with the indignities of separate bathrooms, separate coffee pots, separate dining spaces, and restricted access to meetings. And one story from the book that's not in the movie, a brave computer decides to do something about the segregated seating arrangements. There was a sign that said colored computers on one of the tables in the dining room, identifying the table as the one where black employees were supposed to sit. Then one day, Miriam Mann plucked the sign off the table and stuck it in her purse. A first. I imagine she didn't know what would happen next, or what she would do when it did. The sign reappeared, and when it did, she removed it again. When it returned again, she removed it again, and again. That was incredible courage, says Shetterly. This was still a time when people are lynched, when you could be pulled off the bus for sitting in the wrong seat. There were very, very, very high stakes. But eventually, the sign disappeared. Miriam Mann won. She won that one fight, forgotten until now, pretty much single-handedly. That one fight for freedom. Now, there is a guiding myth about America that has shaped our nation's sense of purpose and destiny. The myth is that this is a land where freedom reigns. Or, as the journalist Robert Brooks put it this week, that America is a grateful inheritor of other people's gifts, that it has a spiritual connection to all people and all places, but also an exceptional role. America culminates history in this myth. It advances a way of life and a democratic model that will provide people everywhere with dignity. The things Americans do, the things we do, are not for ourselves only, but for all mankind. That myth lives and breathes inside many, if not most of us. It inhabits our dreams, even many of us who have been excluded from its promise or hurt by it still dream. It's a beautiful conception myth. We'll say this morning, an inspiring story about our beginnings. But just as we tell different stories to toddlers and to teenagers, It's time we told a more mature version of this myth. Brooks continues, the myth gave America a mission in the world to spread democracy and freedom. It gave us an attitude of welcome and graciousness to embrace the huddled masses yearning to be free and give them the scope by which to realize their powers. The myth still makes me proud to be an American, despite our mistakes and messy past. But it doesn't explain why we have, throughout history, repeatedly and consistently found ways to turn away the huddled masses, whether they were Italians, or Eastern European Jews, or Africans, or Arabs, or Asians. The myth connects us to sacred realities that we are all one, and makes us feel like we're part of something eternal being made manifest here on earth. And so it is a wrenching grief we feel these days, when it seems as if the myth is quickly becoming a fairy tale or a fable, or even worse, an abandoned aspiration. But it also means we have the opportunity today to create and tell a new and more mature myth, which reflects both the firsts that were successes in our history and the firsts that turned out to be failures. We can dare to do this today because the facts, not the alternative facts, just the simple facts, are even more spectacular than the myth. We saw just a few of the facts in the slideshow earlier. February is Black History Month in the United States of America, but we forget that American history is Black history, and that Black history is American history, and that list of firsts are facts. Facts that tell a story of how hundreds of thousands of people persisted and prayed, protested and pushed, risking everything, including their lives, to affirm the truths that are self-evident and protected by the Constitution, that all people are created equal. And all people means everybody, not just white Christian bodies. The facts are even more spectacular than the myth, a myth that can and must evolve. The fact is, Hidden Figures, Black women put a man on the moon for America. And Hidden Figures have always had and still have a huge role to play in making history today, because history, and I quote Margot Lee Shetterly here, is the sum total of what all of us do on a daily basis. We think of capital H history as being these huge figures, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Martin Luther King. But all signs today point to the importance of hidden figures who are willing to try something new, maybe for the very first time. Hidden figures, like the brave judge in Seattle who just lifted the travel ban. Hidden figures like Shannon Boston, our own director of Lifespan Religious Education, who wore a hijab for the first time in her life on National Hijab Day this past week. Shannon was willing to be uncomfortable and to put herself at risk in order to stand in solidarity with colleagues, friends, and neighbors who are terrified about the new administration's approach to immigration, refugee resettlement, and travel to and from many Muslim countries. Hidden figures like Jessica and Dina, who were married yesterday here in this sanctuary and who proudly call themselves the Lesbian Brady Bunch, because they each have children of their own that they adopted and now are a family united by the bonds of marriage legally in the state of Oklahoma because of so many other hidden figures who fought tirelessly for the rights of all people to the privileges once reserved for just a few. Hidden figures like Lisa Schatz, chair of our Justice Council, who told me, and I quote, that for the first time in their lives, all 3 of her children are calling their senators, writing emails, tweeting, and joining their local organizations to publicly fight against the outrageous political happenings. And that for the first time, she and her husband aren't disagreeing and arguing over petty political differences, but instead are having deep conversations about the future of the United States of America and are uniting in a commitment to fight for what's right. Hidden figures like Brenda Allred, a member here who marched for the first time in her life the day after the inauguration and who told me if I had to do it over again, I'd still march, but I might go to Washington instead of going to Oklahoma City. A more mature myth admits that democracy is not inherently good. It's only as good as the people who participate in it, which means that what you do next matters, and what you don't do might matter even more. History is the sum total of what all of us do on a daily basis, and many of us have a feeling that this is a time in history for many more meaningful firsts. We're going to watch a clip together.
Hampton High School is a white school, Mrs. Jackson.
Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware of that.
Virginia, still a segregated state.
Your Honor, you of all people should understand the importance of being first.
How's that, Mrs. Jackson?
Well, you were the first in your family to serve in the armed forces, U.S. Navy, the first to attend university.
What's the point?
I plan on being an engineer at NASA, but I can't do that without taking them classes at that all-white high school. And I can't change the color of my skin. So I have no choice but to be the first, which I can't do without you, sir. Your Honor, out of all the cases you're gonna hear today, which one is gonna matter 100 years from now? Which one is gonna make you the first?
Mary Jackson began her career as a school teacher. When she retired after 30 years with NASA as an engineer, she decided to become an equal opportunity specialist to help women and minorities advance in their chosen careers. In her time at NASA, she had discovered that often it's something as simple as a lack of a couple of courses or the assignments given them that hold people back. Although described as a behind-the-scenes sort of worker, she helped many, many people get promoted or become supervisors. So I have only one question for you this morning. What will you do that's a first for you? What will you do that's a first for you? Will you march? Will you start making 5 calls a day and claim it as part of your spiritual practice? Will you start a conversation circle here at All Souls for Democrats and Republicans to sit down together so we can identify the goals we have in common and start figuring out how we, the people, might move forwards towards those goals? Will you run for office? I read that Trayvon Martin's parents are considering running. Will you get active with the political party of your choice? Democracy may be the best system we have to represent what we know is true in our heart of hearts, that each person has the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But as Justin writes, the promise of democracy is not the same as the promise of love. I'm quoting Justin Demetz, our own worship coordinator and Phillips Theological Seminary student, who posted a larger piece called "Democracy is Not Always Right" on our church blog. To which I would add, the promise of love beyond belief, not of the democratic system, is the promise which must motivate us today. Because every one of us has the power to make that love manifest in our daily lives or not. This week, you might want to take some time to remember your own firsts. What did it take to dare? Which firsts were really worth it? And why? For as Dr. King wrote in his essay, Facing the Challenge of a New Age, there is nothing in all the world greater than freedom. It is worth paying for. It is worth losing a job for. It is worth going to jail for. You go to bed at night, you wake up the next morning, and then yesterday's history, Shetterly says, continuing, our small actions in some ways are more important, or certainly as important, as the individual actions taken by history's towering figures. So I leave you with just one question this morning. What will your first be? Because it might make all the difference 100 years from now.